possesses the five-pointed star shall find himself able to command all beings who creep, swim, crawl, walk, or fly, even to the source from which there is no returning. In the land of Yahi, as in Great Ravens, in Yaha Nephai, as in Yoth, in Yuboth, as in Sufik, in Nakai, as in Gayan, in Kadath, in the cold waste, as in the lake of Hali, in Karlusa, as in Ib, it shall have power. But even as the stars wane and grow cold, even as the suns die and the spaces between the stars grow more great, so wanes the power of all things, of the five-pointed starstone, as of the spells put upon the great old ones by the benign elder gods. And there cometh a time, as once there was a time, when it shall be shown that which is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. This is the Hermetic Hour for Thursday, December 1st, 2011. I'm your host, Poke Runyon. And tonight we feature a discussion on the writings of Howard Phillips Lovecraft and their influence on modern magic, especially that of the Kenneth Grant and the Chaos Magick traditions. We will summarize the Cthulu Mythos and the history of the fabulous Necronomicon. Although both are essentially fiction, we will discuss Lovecraft's dream recall method and the idea proposed by the late Kenneth Grant that Lovecraft actually created what must now be considered a genuine mythology. Lovecraft's demons, loved and feared by millions, have become as real as those of the Goetia, at least in the subjective realm of magic. We will recount some humorous episodes involving Necronomicon fabrications, and we will read, as we did in the beginning, from the most complete text of the Mad Arab's hellish book, the alleged John Dee Translation. So, tune in and shudder to the blasphemous ravings of Abdul Al Hazred. Well, first let me say this. This particular show will come as a pleasant surprise to Nagasiva Arnold, if he happens to be listening, and to some others who have been aware in the past that we've tried to keep waving this little flag saying, come on, the Necronomicon it's fiction, come on. And we Eric Hoffman, Eric, if you're listening too, you'll get a kick out of this. Eric Hoffman and I wrote a little thing called There Ain't No Necronomicon, kind of a little Gilbert and Sullivan type patter song. And it got popular all over the internet. But I'm not going to read that again tonight. No, I'm not. We did this and to try to, to convince people, hey, this is fiction. And as good as it is, it's fiction. And so, at this point, I am going to do a qualified reversal on all of this. And the Necronomicon has finally become, and I have to agree with Kenneth Grant, the Necronomicon and Cthulu Mythos has finally become valid in magic. It really is valid. Now, I'm not saying that I'm recommending it or anything like that, but what I am saying is it is valid because, for two or three reasons. But one, there are literally millions of people who believe it. And just as many people believe just as firmly in Lovecraft's demonic entities as those who believe in the Goetic spirits. And so, and because these entities are
disembodied. This means that they have a validity, and I don't want to be cavalier now. Don't get that idea. This is a good Hermetic principle here. These Lovecraft, and the other reason is Lovecraft was plugged into something. And he was really plugged into something, and he actually dreamed a lot of what he was coming up with. And, most people dream in disjointed kind of ways, but Lovecraft was one of these dreamers that dreamed the whole story. And which meant that he was into what we would call a Jungian sense. He was into the collective unconscious with this. Now, also, we need to look at Lovecraft's background, the man himself, how he grew up, and what he believed in, and this will give us an understanding of why he came up with what he came up with, and it will further explain the validity of it. Now, I'd like to recommend a couple of books here. L. Sprague de Camp, who is a great debunker and whatever, one thing or another, and even perpetrated a Necronomicon hoax himself, which we'll come up with later. L. Sprague de Camp wrote an excellent biography on Lovecraft. Great big thick book, but it's fascinating reading. And Lovecraft fans should really read that book. You'll appreciate it. Now, in the book, in the biography of Lovecraft, de Camp tells us that when little Howard was a kid, he was a prodigy. He was one of these kids that, that really was a little genius. And his mother was very Christian, and she dragged him to Sunday school and tried to make a little Christian out of him. But by the time he was 5 years old, he had declared himself a pagan. And then by the time he was 6 years old, he had little pagan altars around the house, and he had read everything he could get a hold of on Greek mythology, and he became a thoroughgoing pagan. And here's this little kid with his altars and his prayers to the Greek gods, and he just really got into this, and then he went from that to the Arabian Nights. Now, he got into the Arabian Nights so much that he adopted, he had his mother decorate his room, like an Arabian palace, and with this, he was 7 or 8, 9 years old at the time. And guess what his name for himself was at 7 years of age? Abdul Al Hazred. So, but he's thoroughly steeped in the Arabian Nights and the fairy tales and whatever. So, and then as he gets into puberty and becomes a young teenager, he has the disillusionment. And I know because I went through the same thing myself a little bit later in Lovecraft. I bid on Richard Shaver, who was also kind of a Lovecraft kind of a writer. Lovecraft wasn't clinically nuts. Shaver was, but still they wrote about the same kind of things. And I thoroughly believe Shaver. And then boom, I realized, and then at that point I became an agnostic. Well, the same thing happened to Lovecraft. When he became an agnostic, he went totally the other way and became completely skeptical. Now, at a certain point in Lovecraft's life, he became very pessimistic, and he adopted a kind of an anti-social, anti-modern mindset, and he thought he should have lived in an earlier century, and he became, well, basically difficult to get along with people, and he didn't like the word. He criticized everything, and as he got to be a young man, he married a Jewish girl, and they didn't get along. His mother didn't get along with her, and there was a lot of a little bit of prejudice involved one way or another, and so Lovecraft was a kind of an antisocial fella. He was also kind of a hypochondriac, and he was also he wasn't really an outdoorsman. He was kind of a recluse and a bookworm. Okay. Now, I'm not saying this critically. I'm just, we've all had friends that match that description. And for one reason or another, we like them, whatever. But that's the way Lovecraft was. Now, he became, for all of that childhood romance and belief and all of that, he went just the opposite way, and he became philosophically a total materialist. Now, I want to suggest to those of you who are really, really interested in Lovecraft and the mythos and the whole business, I want to suggest that even though it's cheapest copy you can get right now is about $124. Is this book called The Shuttered Room that was put out by Arkham. Let's see, when was it? The date on this thing, 1959. And this is a collection of Lovecraft juvenilia and articles about Lovecraft and nonfiction pieces by Lovecraft. The particular one I'm interested in telling you about here, so you understand Lovecraft and where this mythos comes from and how it works. Lovecraft does an essay in here on materialism, and his philosophy. Now, Lovecraft became, after being a real romantic as a kid, he went the other way. And he's got this essay in here called Idealism and Materialism, a Reflection. And you really want to understand Lovecraft, you got to read this. Because he goes through the whole religious situation. He lays out all of his criticisms of religion and he's totally rejects the idea of an afterlife, and he has a very pessimistic, he's really like Schopenhauer. I mean, it's just very, very pessimistic. And now, From this, when he starts, and now understand this man was a prodigious scholar. He spent all of his waking hours researching and reading and whatever. He really knew ancient history. He knew mythologies. He was not really a practicing occultist, but he was very familiar with occult literature. And he wasn't a practical occultist because, frankly, he didn't believe magic worked, and he didn't, and yet this dream life of his was able to bring this mythos of his forward, and this is a very interesting thing. He becomes a channel. Now, it's almost he denied this, of course, and he said, "Oh no, I'm not channeling. This is all fiction." But in fact, because of the dynamics, and we did a show sometime back called the Enoch, the Enoch syndrome, where we talk about this kind of thing and people who have channeled all these visions and whatever. And Lovecraft fits into that category. He really does. His psychology and his upbringing and his condition, everything, put him in a position where he became a channel for something. And what he ended up creating was a dark form of Gnosticism. And what he ended up creating here was phenomenally, it was more than what you could come up with just by sitting down and saying, okay, I'm going to create a phony mythology. No, this was far deeper than that. Far deeper. Now, one of the ways one of the things that's very amazing about this is the first story of Lovecraft's that deals with what we call the Cthulu Mythos, or what eventually became the Cthulu Mythos. The first story, one of his earliest, 1921, The Nameless City. Now, his style at that point was still pretty florid, pretty purple. He was using a lot more adjectives than he should have used. And the story is kind of, as you read it, you kind of have to think, oh boy, I gotta remember he was kind of young when he wrote this thing. But still, if you knock out all the adjectives, and it's a good story. And what it is an archaeologist out in the empty quarter in the Arabian desert gets into this incredibly ancient city, earlier than Ubar or anything like that. I mean, he gets this incredibly ancient city, and gets down into this catacomb underneath the city and finds mummified, intelligent dinosaur bodies. Get this now. Now, Lovecraft did not know at that time, nobody knew how intelligent raptors really were. You know, I remember from Jurassic Park, the raptors. Well, the raptors were the most intelligent of the dinosaurs. It was kind of small, a little miniature version of Tyrannosaurus Rex, but they were very intelligent. But nobody knew that then. So here he finds these evolved dinosaur bodies mummified in this story. And then he goes and he opens up a deeper abyss and looks out into this chaos, which is obviously a doorway to another dimension. Now, this is where the Cthulhu Mythos gets started. And what Lovecraft did not know, had no way of knowing, was that 65 million years ago, the planet got hit right smack in the biggest sulfur deposit on the planet, got smacked by a meteor, and killed off in less than a year all of the big dinosaurs, including the raptors. Yeah, 65 million years ago. So the principle of the Cthulhu Mythos actually happened because those creatures, those reptiles, were the dominant species on the planet. There was a phenomenal, like a Sodom and Gomorrah, bam, right in the spot where they were. You would almost have to be God Almighty to know where that meteor ought to hit to do what it did. And Lovecraft had no way of knowing that. Now, the implications of this, of course, we explored the implications of this in more recent times, but Lovecraft based his Cthulhu Mythos on this kind of an idea, that these monsters who once were the dominant species on the planet, they were wiped out, but then they existed in another dimension and they wanted to come back. And they never did forgive the elder gods for doing to them what happened. Well, now what Lovecraft eventually did, and what he is following, because he had other writers working, other writers, Clark Ashton Smith and Howard and Locke and various other writers, including Lynn Carter, they all picked up and added to this. Because, people did the same thing with Shaver. You had Howard Phillips and Macaulay and various people going along with Shaver. Same thing. They liked the idea, so they added to it. But what ended up developing here was a mythos that was very, very much like the negative, dark versions of Gnosticism. That became the template for this thing. And so here, what we have here is it's not a religion. It's a mythology that is it's not really prehistoric, but it's almost pre-human. And this really resonated with lots of people. They really liked it because it had a very, very eerie feeling. You had a feeling when you read these stories that, this guy's really, this is what it's really all about. And you got that feeling. And I had that feeling when I was a kid. I read everything Lovecraft ever wrote, and I think I still have it, around here one way or another. But fortunately now, Barnes & Noble, now this is something for you Lovecraft fans, Barnes & Noble has come out now with a great big doorstopper of a book, and it's relatively inexpensive, of all of Lovecraft's fiction, everything. You get the whole business, and you get, the Reanimator and all those stories you couldn't find before. You can find them in this big Barnes & Noble book. It's a good Christmas present for somebody. You're down at Barnes & Noble, and you can get it, I guess, for, less than $20, and, it's good. You get it all. Now, the thing about the Cthulhu Mythos is that it's dark, and it's the elder gods contained the great old ones, and and imprisoned them. This is very much like the Book of Enoch, by the way. That's another thing that, of course, influenced Lovecraft, and the Cthulhu Mythos is influenced by the Book of Enoch, which means that really what we have here with the Cthulhu Mythos, and I know some people aren't going to want to hear this, but doggone it, it's true, that the Cthulhu Mythos is a form of Hermetic magic. It really is. It's a Gnostic form, but it uses some of the same basic myth themes, and yet it moves this back to a pre-human condition, and when you start using it on this template, and then if you realize, of course, as I say, that Lovecraft was plugged into something here, he was channeling something, and he became the vehicle for it, but this does have a resonance, it has a validity, and the very fact that it does resonate with so many people kind of tends to prove that out. One of the things that I think we should mention here before we get any further, I read a little passage that ended up with a passage everybody knows. You know, I wanted to. Zandria suggested that we open up with a passage from the Necronomicon, and I said, well, if we're going to do that, let's do it on one that everybody knows. At least we'll end with the couplet here that everybody knows, and with strange eons, even death may die, and everyone knows that one. So that's what I did. Now I read to you from the alleged John Dee translation of the Necronomicon, annotated by my dear friend and former mentor and a guy I grew up with, Linwood Carter. And Lynn he died in 1988. Lynn was one of the most ardent fans of Lovecraft's work. Lynn studied it, and Lynn was an expert on it. And Lynn has, by the way, when you get, those of you who want to really dig into this, when you get the shuttered room, you will find that a couple of the treasures in the shuttered room are Lynn's essay on the gods, the books that Lovecraft cites, some of them fictional, some of them not, and a whole lexicon of the gods, the Cthulhu Mythos, and descriptions of them and how they fit into the mythos. So this is something that Lynn really knew about. Now, Lynn was a very prolific author. Some of his work was a little bit what you might call the potboiler, and because he had to make a living, and he made a darn good living as a writer of science fiction and fantasy. And some of his work is wonderful, and some of it is exciting. Lynn's work is always fun to read, and some of it is absolutely great. But Lynn over the years, he just continued to study Lovecraft, and he wrote Lovecraftian stories occasionally, and he participated in Lovecraft study circles and led them and whatever. But now the important thing here is we're going to get into these hoaxes here. Lynn Carter perpetrated the first Necronomicon hoax. Now, what he did, he told me this personally. What he did was this was about, I guess, 1949, something like that. And Lynn, by the way, was 10 years older than I was. And so he was in his 20s, and 1949 or 50. And there was one of the first science fiction conventions in New York. Now, Lynn, he was a fairly good artist, and he came up with this page on parchment paper and in brown ink, and he did this one page of the so-called Necronomicon. So he did this thing up with some, kind of like an old manuscript, and he baked it in the oven, and he stomped on it, and he spilled coffee on it, and he rumpled it up, and he made it look like it was old. He put it in a little glass frame and whatever. And he told a couple of these kids at the convention that he had a page of the real Necronomicon, and he showed it to them. And that was when that started off the idea that there really was a real Necronomicon. So Lynn he floated that one. Now, Lynn's friend L. Sprague de Camp, he claims that he did the first Necronomicon hoax, but Lynn beat him to it. But L. Sprague de Camp really did. Oh, God, he really did it. L. Sprague de Camp was an ardent debunker. He liked to debunk everything, including Lovecraft. Although he's very sympathetic to Lovecraft, he wrote the biography. But de Camp got, he and his friend of his went over to Baghdad, and they on an archaeological expedition or something or other, and they got some Arab scribe to do about 13 pages of something that looked like gibberish, but it looked kind of like it might be some flowery form of Arabic script or whatever. They claimed it was Duriac, not Syriac. Nobody ever heard of it. Syriac is a type of related to Arabic, but it's different. And Duriac, no, I don't think anybody's ever seen Duriac, so that's what they claimed it was. And it was 13 pages of this stuff. So that wasn't enough to do a whole Necronomicon, but that was about all the guy could manage. And so they got that, and then they ran it. Every 13 pages, this thing repeats itself for 13 pages, so it goes on for a couple hundred pages, and that's pretty impressive. And unless you really, really get into it, you don't realize that it has been repeated. And they published this thing, and de Camp wrote a pseudo-archaeological preface to it and all of this. And that, well, de Camp did it as a joke. I personally have some friends who spent $50 a copy for this thing or more than that, and they didn't think it was a joke when they found out that it wasn't. But anyway, so de Camp did that one. Now, the next Necronomicon hoax, and I don't know what you can call it hoax or not, but let's say that it, whether it's a hoax or not, I'll leave it up to you, was a thing done by Peter Levenda, who wrote under the name of Simon. And this was something I think Herman Slater had something to do with. But anyway, they came up with this leather-bound. Oh, it was a fancy production, and they advertised it all over the country. And it was Assyrian Akkadian demonology. They got some stuff, I think, by Lenormant that had not been translated into English, and so that's why it was kind of, in a way, sort of unique. But it was essentially Assyrian Akkadian demonology. And then they put a little thing about Abdul Al Hazred in the back, and then they had a little preface in the front. And then they got an artist to do their sigils for them. And I couldn't figure out, when I looked at this thing, when the heck are we got sigils that are half monogram and half kamea and half something else? And this is really, oh boy. So I finally talked, I didn't make a big effort to find it, but I found the artist who actually did them. And he said, I don't know, I don't think about sigils. I just looked at a bunch of old magic books and whatever looked good, and I put them together, and that was it. And so we have sigils that don't work very well. Anyway, and they stuck this in. Now, this book came out in leather. Oh boy, it was a beautiful production. And then it came out in the paperback all over the place. It probably had more, more people probably have it than any other version of the Necronomicon, but it is dangerous. The book's dangerous in the sense that it really is genuine, honest to goodness, Akkadian Assyrian demonology. Like Pazuzu, the exorcist. Oh boy. So it's dangerous, and people have gotten in trouble with it. And there's no banishing, and and the sigils don't work, and so, boy, you get into this thing, and there's only one way that you can be safe using this, and this is, my friend, I don't know whether Frater Shem is listening, and I hope he is, but if not, he will be later. But my friend Frater Shem got into this when he was a teenager. Oh boy, but then he realized, he was a smart teenager, he realized, hey, this is not the Necronomicon, this is Akkadian Assyrian demonology. So he said, well, the only way I can do this and do it right is to really research that tradition, and then I can balance it out, and I could use the forces, the positive forces, and to balance the negative forces, and I can work it. But you have to do that. You can't do it from just what these guys put out in this segment. So avoid that one, except to read it. I mean, it's just okay. But that's not the Necronomicon. Now, where do we find a real Necronomicon? Okay. I think, now this is just my opinion, other people are going to differ with me on this and that and the other thing, and I'm sure they will, but I think that Lynn Carter's 100-page alleged John Dee translation, I think that's the best and the most complete Necronomicon. I really do, and as far as I'm concerned, that's it, because Carter is certainly was an authority. He was the fantasy editor of Ballantine books, and he had all the credentials, and he really dug in, and he had a marvelous imagination, and he actually, and I'm going to read some more sections from it, and let make up your own mind. Now, one of the things I want to kind of warn you about a little bit when you get into the Dee translation, the first 5, I think, well, maybe first 4 or 5. The first 4 or 5 tales are cautionary tales, and they're Abdul Al Hazred's adventures and how he learns about sorcery the hard way. And there's about 5 of these things, and they all end up terribly. Abdul, he escapes, but everybody else dies or gets eaten or loses their souls or something like that. So the first 5 stories are like, well, they're cautionary tales. But this is justified because there's a hint. Lovecraft gave a hint that the beginning of the Necronomicon was Abdul Al Hazred's adventures learning to be a sorcerer, and he kind of said that. So Carter was justified in doing this. But once Carter gets through, the Necronomicon gets through with these cautionary tales, that's when it gets really, really into it. And quite frankly, Lynn Carter, when I first started the OTA, I had my vision back in 1969. I almost died, and I discovered the secret of the Goetia. Carter, hey, he was the old man on this thing, and I said, I wrote him and said, Lynn, I've got this, I'm really into this, and Lynn was advising me on books to read, and we were talking back and forth on it, and at one point, I even asked him if he would kind of be our senior advisor over there, and he said, I don't want to get involved in that, but he said, I'll give you all the advice privately that you want. So Carter knew Hermetic magic, and now and more so than Lovecraft, actually. Lovecraft was the channel for this stuff. Carter was the man who knew the Hermetic system. And let's face it, if Abdul Al Hazred had lived in Yemen way back in the 8th century, he would have been a South Sabaean, and very, very thinly, he would have been just a Muslim on the surface. He would have been, at root, he would have been a South Sabaean, a planet worshiper. And this fits in. And they became, of course, the North Sabaeans or the Iranians, but the Sabaean tradition adopted the Hermetic tradition, interpenetrated with the Hermetic tradition, influenced it, and everything else. That's where the Picatrix comes from. Now, the Picatrix, you can take Carter's Necronomicon, and you can take the Picatrix, and I recommend that you get the English translation of the Latin Picatrix, which was the one that we all, used in Europe in the old days. And this is the Christopher Warnock, John Michael Greer version of the Picatrix. You can get that, and you can sit down with Lynn's Necronomicon, and you can sit down with the Picatrix, and you can just see where they go together. And you can say, because the Necronomicon is celestial or cosmic necromancy. Yes, it is. And so is the Picatrix. And this is why some people have suggested that the Picatrix is the real Necronomicon. No, the Necronomicon's the Necronomicon, but you can take the Picatrix from that period where the Necronomicon was alleged to come from, and you can put the two together, and you can read the two of them together, and you'll see that we're talking about the same thing. Now, although the Picatrix is not quite on as much on the abysmal, miserable, the world is an awful place kind of thing, it's more evenly balanced. It's more hermetic in that respect. And one of the things, of course, about the Necronomicon is it's very dark, but it's very dark. But then on the other hand, if you're into negative gnosis, if you think the world is a terrible place, and if you don't like people and you don't like the world, what was it? The Kingston Trio said, South Africans hate the Dutch, and I don't like anybody very much. If you are in that negative set, a lot of us are, then the Necronomicon might work for you better than the regular hermetic tradition. If you're not, if you think the world is a nice place and you like people, then I would say read the Necronomicon for knowledge and for whatever, but don't practice it. Now, with that in mind, I want to just delve in a little bit. Let's savor some Necronomicon here, because this is naturally as much as Lynn put as much into this as he could. He put as much Lovecraft and as much that other people came up with, the rest of the Cthulhu writers, as he could possibly get. But he also plugged into the current. Now, I'm going to read the Book of the Gates of the Worlds Beyond This World and the Modes of Travel. Knowest thou that this world of ours is not alone in the infinitude of space, for there be myriads of other worlds amongst the stars, and that life clingeth tenaciously wherever it hath found a foothold. And while there be wise men upon the earth, both in our day and in the ages gone to dust, there be far wiser than they elsewhere, and the sorcerer must search out the wisest teacher ever he may find. Albeit needful, he seeketh afar in remote and fabulous bournes beyond the world we know, and intelligence is deeper and older and wiser than men. Reside on Yadith, the Doles, and on Yamar and Yith, and on Zoath, and of the metal brains, and Abith, and the worm Shagai, or Continental the Soth, and the transgalactic Strunti, aye, and the benighted Yugoth, where she rolleth at the rim. But which of the children of men have ever seen Yugoth? Much less the worlds that lie beyond in the vertiginous and sickening abyss of endless immeasurable space. It is on Yugoth and the outer one, where the outer ones dwell, they whose leader is even the Gai Kotun, and who be the minions and servitors of him who is not to be named. On earth are they beknown to men as the abominable Myko, and have the form of lizard crustaceans noxious to the eyes of men, but on dim Yugoth they rear nightmarish cities of monolithic stone, riven through and through with deep canals like terrible chasms, where through slow and sluggishly rivers of viscous black ooze, like unto liquid pitch, betimes they visit this earth,
and have commerce with men, they who serve great Hastur in the star spaces, and some say the lizard crustaceans arrive on earth through their towers, which are imperishable, elemental, and that feeleth not the bite of the black and frigid winds that blow between the worlds, while others say that they fly hither wearing artificial wings that bear against the particles whereof light is formed, as do their brethren, the Bayaki. But we are not Margot, but mortal men, and cannot traverse the gulfs between the stars with impunity or ease. And now there are other ways to visit the worlds that rule forever in the darkness beyond the earth, and some there are that men may comfortably take. In Thenoth, that was of old a great metropolis in Mu before the floundering thereof, a mode was found to harness the Dehuna energies, whereby could the bodies of men be shielded in envelopes of folded space, thus venturing to the stars, and on upon they speak of the maze of the 7,000 crystal frames, and of the faces that beautifully pass the 3,333rd frame, where the dead mouths gape and gulp, and who knoweth aught today of the maze whereof they the Tond spake. And there is also a way to the Yugoth that doth not pass through the star spaces, but between them. By the plains between the star spaces it mote well be, come hither, O Cthulhu. But little there is beknownst for certain of this mode, save that it lieth beyond the zone of the 13 Babelote Colossi. And there be also the reversed angles of Tan Platur, whereby mayhap the Afi visited earth in the prime, descending hither by way of Shagai, Yugoth, and Tond. And now may the way there through be lost in its eternity to the knowledge of living men, even in the benighted ignorance of our own later day. For the secret priests of Sebek and the hierophants of olden Karnak were once conversant with the mystery of the Tarka Kalur in their ancient time, and the mode and the methods thereof may yet be deciphered from some crumbling papyri thieved out of the nighted tomb. Now, this is not, I wouldn't say this is actually a high point. This is representative of the Dee Translation of the Necronomicon. And what you just heard is quite representative of it. I remember Wade Long, the Goetic magician, he once described this Dee Translation as John Dee on acid. but I think it certainly stimulates more than just Hollywood. This is far deeper than a goth party or a rave or something like that. This is worthy of serious consideration. Now, there is one thing though that I want to caution you about, and that is if you're going to work this system. If you really are, and I can't, we know it's very popular and it has a tremendous power and validity and everything. If you're going to work it, then don't just work this without understanding the balance. Don't. This is one of the reasons why I really want to recommend the Lynn's version of the Necronomicon, because it is on a Hermetic template, and it does offer you some protection. And in fact, just to give you an idea, I thought as a little exercise here, I would kind of construct a little Necronomicon pentagram ritual for you to give you an idea of what it would be like.
Now, if you're standing in the center of your circle, you might say, before me, Hastur, behind me, Cthulhu, at my right hand, Cthulhu, at my left hand, Shub-Niggurath, above me, Nyarlathotep, beneath me, Yog-Sothoth. Behold the pentagram upon the grey stone of Manar, behold the elder sign, and lend thy power unto me. Now, that is the kind of ritual you can construct from Lynn's Necronomicon. And this means that you do have a balance, because the idea here is that, and this is good, solid magical principle, that the elder gods contains the great old ones. The great old ones, of course, in this case, we have Hastur, who represents air, and he's an air elemental, and then we got Cthulhu, who is a fire elemental in the south, and Cthulhu, who is the water, is like Poseidon, he's the water god, and Shub-Niggurath is the dark earth mother, and she's in the north. Now, of course, Nyarlathotep is the messenger and the messenger of chaos, and Yog-Sothoth is the gate, but Yog-Sothoth is subterranean, so Yog-Sothoth is of the earth. Now, these are contained and imprisoned by the benign elder gods. And there's a lot of Gnosticism involved in this, and of course, as I say, it has a kind of a Hermetic template. So this is what you need to know, and you need to know why, and you need to. So there is not just don't throw yourself into evil. I don't care how miserable you may be and how much psychic suicide you think you want to commit. That's not a good idea. That's not it. If you're going to do this, do it right. And this is why I say this is the best. But now you want to know where to get Lynn's Necronomicon. Okay, that's easy. Colosseum, edited by Robert M. Price, who he's the executor of Lynn Carter's estate. That's Robert M. Price, and he's the editor for Chaosium books. And they have a book called The Necronomicon, Selected Stories and Essays Concerning the Blasphemous Tome of the Mad Era. Now, this is the book, and this book contains Lynn's 100-page Necronomicon. It does, except that there is one catch. One catch here. Well, it contains Lynn's Necronomicon, except for the last 6 lines. The last 6 lines are not there. I'm not going to say why, but the last 6 lines are not there. So, get your pencils out. I'm going to repeat this very, very slowly. I'm going to read the last 6 lines to you, because if you're going to get this and you're going to work with this one, then you certainly need to know the last 6 lines. And this is like the Quran. They say, well, if you finish the Quran, you get it all the way finished, then you have to convert to Islam. Well, the Necronomicon, if you don't have the last 6 lines, well, so here we go. So get your pencils ready, and you can come back, of course, and listen to this program again, which I'm sure if you're Lovecraft fans, you're going to want to do that. And you'll very carefully copy this down. Now, if the spelling bothers you, then you can become an associate member of our Hermetic, Church of Hermetic Sciences. You can join our associate member program, and we will send you the actual 6-line text. But here it is. Let's see, I'll have 6 lines. Where the Ticho dwell, thou shalt go without dread of any beings or creatures that serve them from the outside. Aye, neither the ghouls, the shantoks, the gaunts of the night, the cold ones, the bayaki, the miri negri, the high, nor the fire vampires may offer peril nor harm to him who beareth about him the stone from Manar. Okay?
Those are the last 6 missing lines of the Necronomicon. And I will read them again, just so you know. Where the Ticho dwell, thou shalt go without dread of any beings or creatures that serve them from outside. Aye, neither the ghouls, the shantaks, the gaunts of the night, the cold ones, the bayaki, or the miri nigri, the Ai-Hai, nor the fire vampires may offer peril nor harm to him who beareth about him the stone from Manar. And now you have it all, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening, and the most comfortable and positive of dreams. And be sure and tune in next week when we will have another session of the Hermetic Hour, in which we will try to delve into something more positive, but just as profound, hopefully. And meanwhile, good magic.